Starting off with the worst evolution in the game, we got the Evolved Tesla. Ever since they removed its Death Shockwave, it has been significantly easier to break through. It doesn't get nearly as much value, which is why it's by far the worst building evolution in the game. The second worst evolution in the game is going to be the Evolved Goblin Drill. Ever since they reworked it so it doesn't deal death damage every time it respawns, it has been drastically worse, and there's not many people that prefer using it over the regular Goblin Drill. The Evolved Snowball, even after the couple of buffs it has received, it still remains to be one of the worst evolutions in the game, because there's still some scenarios where the regular Snowball is going to be a bit better in some situations, so the Evolved Snowball is just not very consistent, and you're going to be much better off using something like the Evolved Zap. The Evolved P.E.K.K.A, guys, is going to be the start of D tier. She has fallen off quite a lot ever since the P.E.K.K.A got that range nerf. It has significantly impacted the Evolved P.E.K.K.A, and it is just used much less. In fact, there's even some people now that prefer using the regular P.E.K.K.A over the Evolved version ever since they reworked it, so the amount of healing it does based on the unit it kills is different. Next is going to be the Evolved Wizard. Ever since the nerf, the shield knockback, and also the shield hit points, he has been toned down a lot, and he's had a hard time finding a place in the meta, but you can definitely use him in some off-meta decks if you want and make him work. Evolved Battle Ram is going to be next. There's a lot of stuns that reset him, like the E-Wiz, for example, or any kind of reset. And if you have a building, of course, it's a lot more manageable to stop him. And if you have something heavy, it's definitely going to be able to stop it from reaching your tower. So I feel like it's overall not too difficult to deal with, but you can use it in bridge spam decks if you want to. Evolved Musketeer is going to be next. They gave her a couple buffs, which has definitely helped her out. But for the most part, you're only going to be able to use her in things like Giant Graveyard and Loon Cycle. And I think overall, if you know what you're doing and you can block her long shots with a unit and protect and predict her, then in some scenarios she gets pretty much no value. This might be surprising, guys, but the Evolved Barbarians are finally not in the bottom two tiers. Maybe it's because they were given out for free for the Valentine's Day event. A lot of people have found decks that they're good in. People have been using them again in things like Bridge Spam, Giant Graveyard, Golem, and more. So they're not as bad as they were before, and people have realized they actually get a little bit of value. Next are going to be the Evolved Archers. You can use them in things like Expo or Giant Graveyard, but arrows are still so prevalent in the meta. Even after the Radius nerf the arrows received, they're being used so much, and overall, the Evolved Archers are pretty underwhelming and easy to deal with if you know what you're doing, especially because they're so low in hit points. And it's kind of the same scenario for the Evolved Firecracker. She's going to be very useful in things like Hog Cycle, but that's kind of going to be about it. And the main drawback of the Firecracker is the King activation, and there's so many decks where you can't afford to be letting your opponent get an easy King activation, which is why, in my opinion, she's always going to be kept in check, even though casuals really hate her. Next is going to be the Evolved Mortar. Since we've had a beatdown meta recently, it's been a lot harder for the Evolved Mortar to lock on the tower, making it significantly worse, and it has just been toned down a lot recently, as we've seen a lot of cards that synergize well with the Mortar get nerfed. That has, of course, as expected, bring down the usage of the Evolved Mortar and make it more manageable to deal with. The Evolved Royal Giant's going to be next. I feel like his evolution is very situational. If you're playing against a building or an air deck, it's practically useless. But of course, if you're playing against something like a mini P.E.K.K.A or Barbarians, that knockback is going to be incredibly useful. So it's very matchup dependent, and I think it's overall a well-balanced evolution in that sense. The Evolved Mega Knight, this is kind of surprising, guys, but it's going in C tier. I thought after the Evolved P.E.K.K.A got pretty much killed after the P.E.K.K.A nerf, I was thinking the Evolved Mega Knight was going to be a lot better, and people thought that at first too, and last month we definitely saw a big rise in the usage of Mega Knight, but recently in this current meta, there have not been a lot of people running the Mega Knight, and I think it's because of some other evolutions just being significantly stronger than it, and overall, if you know what you're doing, you can defend him without too much of an issue. But it's been interesting to see and definitely unexpected. The Evolved Dark Goblin as well, guys, has really fallen off. It went all the way from S and A tier all the way to C because there have just been way less people using it. A big part of it is because of arrows and log, people realizing they can kill it without too much trouble. But the other big reason is because the Dart Goblin's damage got nerfed. So there's less people using the Dart Goblin in general. And because, of course, you have to use the regular Dart Goblin to eventually get to the evolved version, with the regular version being worse, that, of course, is going to really impact the evolved version, which is why there's way less people using it. We're going to start off B tier with the Evolved Bomber. Even though there's way less people using it in cycle decks, now that it doesn't get that additional bounce on top of towers, in beatdown decks especially, it is still more than viable. You will commonly see this card in things like Electro Giant, Golem, Lava Hound, maybe Giant Graveyard, heavier decks, but in cycle, it's pretty much not viable, which is why in cycle decks, you don't see it and why it's no longer S tier. So in my opinion, good change to the Evolved Bomber because it's still viable, but not completely dead. The Evolved Goblin Giant is going to be in B tier as well. Definitely a bit worse ever since they gave it that nerf where it doesn't spawn goblins as frequently now, ever since they made that change. And also with the Chef not being absolutely broken anymore, that has helped balance him out as well. And then the Evolved E-Drag is going to be next. This is one where it's kind of like the Royal Giant. It's very situational and depends on the matchup, because when you're against a beatdown deck, this thing is basically S tier. But when you're against a cycle deck, it's basically F tier, which is why it kind of balances out to being an average evolution, and it's so matchup based, which can be kind of annoying sometimes, but it's just how it is. I mean, if you're running a beatdown deck and you don't have a lightning, it's just getting infinite value. But if you're playing against a cycle deck with basically no tanks, it's not really doing anything. So that's kind of just how it is. The Evolved Skeletons, even though there's 3 instead of 4, they have still proven to be very valuable, especially in cycle decks. You're just not going to be able to run them in every deck in the game anymore, which is probably how it should be. So was a very good change to them, making them kind of a more balanced evolution. Still going to be very good inside of things like Hog, for example, Royal Hogs, and even in some heavier things from time to time, like the Royal Giant. Now, this is a tiny bit of a prediction, but in my opinion, the Evolved Hunter is going to be next. I don't think it's a broken evolution, but I also don't think it's going to be bad either. It seems to be pretty balanced, especially because it's a 2-cycle evolution. In some matchups, it's not going to get as much value, of course, especially when you're against cycle decks. But if you're against a heavier deck, say Lava Hound, for example, oh my goodness, it can pretty much take out a whole Lava Loon push on his own. Absolutely insane. And then that would also apply to things, of course, like Electro Giant, Golem, anything super heavy. Royal Giant, it's going to be outstanding against, but then cycle decks, it's not going to be as good, or bait. So it really just depends. The Evolved Royal Recruits are going to be next. This is a controversial one because I know so many people hate the recruits and think they're absolutely broken. But in my opinion, it's not just the recruits that are strong, it's the things that are used with the recruits. For example, things like the Evolved Wall Breakers, the Evolved Goblin Cage, which I personally think are a little better than the Evo recruits, which helps them be good. And after the change they got, where it takes them a little bit longer to charge, that has definitely helped balance them out a tiny bit. And I don't think they're as broken as people think they are. It's just the cards that synergize well with them. For example, the Evolved Goblin Cage is a big reason behind that. Commonly with the recruits, you're always seeing the Evolved Goblin Cage. It's such good synergy because it just is unbreakable defense in a lot of scenarios. And the Evo Cage is also used in other things as well, like Electro Giant, Lava Hound, Splash Yard. So it's a very versatile evolution. The main drawback of it is it's useless against air decks. When you're playing against a Lava Hound deck or Loon Cycle, it's pretty much doing absolutely nothing compared to what the regular Cage would do. And that's one of the only reasons why it's not absolutely broken. We're going to start off A tier with the Evolved Goblin Barrel. This thing is absolutely incredible in so many different things. Of course, it's going to be good in OG bait decks where you're kind of used to running a bait deck with the Inferno or the Cannon or the Tesla, your building of choice, but then it can also be very good with the Evo Royal Recruits, which people have started synergizing with it. And that's a really disgusting combination, which is why I think a lot of people hate the recruits at the moment. A big part of it is because of this, but because it shows you where the fake barrel is now and the real one, I think that's what prevents it from being S tier and why it's not as broken anymore. But the Evo barrel is still so good because you still have to defend 2 Goblin Barrels at the end of the day, especially if both lanes are getting tanked for. You cannot ignore that fake one, which is why it's very strong. And next we have the Evolved Wall Breakers. These things are very strong as well, especially ever since they increased the amount of death damage they do, these things for 2 elixir just blow up everything. It is absolutely ridiculous. I think the only reason why they're not S tier is because of things like the Cannoneer, as well as the Dagger Duchess Tower Troops, which kind of help keep them in check a tiny bit, because of course those are going to be better against them than the Princess Tower is, and also you have other buildings that are really broken right now, like the Evo Cannon, but I think if it wasn't for stuff like that, they would definitely be S tier. The bats, in my opinion, always an underrated evolution. A lot of casual players don't think they're very good, but I think the reason they're so solid is because of their versatility. You can use them in so many different things. You can use them with things like the Evo Wall Breakers, for example, inside of a Mega Knight deck. You could use them in Mortar. You could run them in Baity decks with the Miner. You can run them just in Swarmy type decks and E-Golem, Toxic, things like that. Bridge spam, you can really just make them work in a lot of different things. I mean, they tend to pair well in a lot of off-meta decks or just synergize well with other evolutions, and I think that's really the appeal behind them and why they're just always an above-average evolution no matter what the meta is. The Evolved Valkyrie is going to be next. She's especially very good inside of Lava Hound decks. That's where she really shines. You can, of course, use her in some other things like Hog X NATO and maybe... what else? Graveyard, potentially. But Lava is where she's really known to be very good, because you can just build a big Lava push and then defend everything if they go in the other lane with an Evo Valk. It can just defend any win condition. It's just absolutely incredible. But in my opinion, guys, the Evolved Knight is actually a bit better than the Evolved Valkyrie at the moment, which might be surprising you guys, because this hasn't been the case for a while now, but the Knight has been making a return, especially in some things like log bait decks. A lot of bait players prefer using the Knight, which is 1 elixir less for that shield effect and tanking for a long time. People are really liking that. Also in Graveyard, many people are using the Knight again as well. And then you can also use him in other things like with the Hog Rider, for example, and Expo. So I just think he's a bit more versatile than the Valkyrie currently, and there's just a little bit more people using him. But that's something that seems to change depending on the meta and the month. Next is going to be the Evolve Ice Spirit. This is probably surprising to a lot of people, because now that it only slows things down for 2 times instead of 3, people thought that was going to kill it, but I guess because it does an additional amount of damage, that helped kind of compensate for that nerf a bit, and it is still one of the very best evolutions in the game. You commonly see it so much inside of cycle decks, whether it's Royal Hog Cycle, maybe you're running a Expo deck as well. It could be a Goblin Drill deck. It could be, for example, a Mortar deck. It is just so solid in Cycle especially. And then even in some other things like Bridge Spam, and it just allows your defense to be really solid, holding things in place for such a long time. And now, guys, we get to S tier. The Evo Zap, guys, kind of like the Evo Ice Spirit. It's surprising how good it is still, even after the nerf it got, where it only zaps things 2 times instead of 3. The reason why is because in beatdown decks, it's essentially a requirement. Pretty much most of the beatdown decks you see nowadays run the Evolve Zap. And it's simply because the Evolve Snowball is just so bad still, even after the buffs it got. So beatdown decks don't really have a choice other than running the Evolve Zap, which is why you're always seeing it with things like the Goblin Giant, the Lava Hound. What else? I mean, Giant Graveyard, you commonly see it as well. Giant Prince decks or the Evo Lumberjack decks often use the Evo Zap. P.E.K.K.A as well, even though there's less people running P.E.K.K.A now after the nerf, so many people are using it, where you're almost always seeing the Evo Zap. And then, guys, the Evo Cannon, even after the Cannon nerf, where the Cannon now they were originally going to nerf the damage of the cannon, but they opted to go for the fire rate nerf of the cannon instead. Even though that has been the case, it has not impacted the evolved cannon very much, because its evolution is just so broken. It's so defensive. I mean, you're literally getting 9 bombs dropping from the sky, exploding, and in double and triple elixir, you can just imagine how much value that is in so many scenarios. It's just absolutely absurd. I mean, especially if you're playing against bait decks or swarm things, but even if you're against beatdown decks, I mean, let's say a Golem Night Witch is coming down. You literally play it, and then it's hitting the Golem and the Night Witch, killing like all the bats, and there might be a baby dragon there as well. So it really kind of makes your opponent struggle, because they don't want to clump everything together when they know you have your Evo Cannon and Cycle, but sometimes it's like, what choice do they have? So you can see why it's just so valuable, and in a lot of the cycle decks now, so many of them are using the Evo Cannon, especially Log Bait, Hog Rider, Royal Hogs, Goblin Drill, but then even in some heavier things like Graveyard as well, which is why it's just so good. And then lastly, guys, we got the Evolved Lumberjack, which of course is going at the top of S tier, even though it got that nerf where you can't stack it anymore, where you can go in for another rage spell to essentially make the Evo Lumberjack just be alive infinitely. It has still proven to be the best evolution in the game by far. He's just incredibly versatile. You just can fit him in so many different decks, and he has definitely revived Beatdown. It's why I think we have a really big Beatdown in Bridge Spam meta right now. It's definitely because of this guy. I mean, it's absolutely incredible inside of things like Golem, inside of things like Giant, inside of Goblin Giant, with the Battle Ram, with the Ram Rider, and it is just so annoying for people to deal with. And yeah, when he runs out of the rage, of course, then he kind of expires and dies really quick. But this is why he's so valuable on defense too, because when you're defending a push, and the units you know are going to be staying in the radius of the rage when he dies, he's just going to stay there defending everything. So he's not only good on offense, I would say, if anything, the nerf has kind of made him worse on offense, but he's still just as good on defense. So there's just so many different ways you can use him throughout the match. It's not even only on offense, it's defense too. But then offensively, once you have other things paired with the Evo Lumberjack, say you're sending it in with a Royal Giant, for example, or a Giant, you know they have to defend the Giant or the thing near it, so that means they're inevitably going to have to play things in the Rage spell, which means it's not that difficult to make sure it's staying inside of the Rage in a lot of circumstances. So hopefully that makes sense of explaining why he's still very broken and likely still needs another nerf. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe if you guys are not subscribed already. You can use creator code BOSS to support me in any Supercell game. Let me know if you guys prefer how I recorded this evolution tier list this time around, where I literally didn't edit at all. Oftentimes, when I'm naming each card, I'll have a edit or a cut in between instead of just talking basically the whole time like this without edits. Do you guys prefer raw footage like this, or do you think my explanations are better when I have editing, a little bit of editing, and take kind of a break in between each one? Let me know which style you guys prefer, and thanks again until next time, guys.